What is up, CSP fam? This video podcast is dedicated to talking about principles and ideas that help you brand your business using story-based marketing. Remember, your brand isn't what you say about your organization, it's what other people tell other people about your organization. So with some time left already, let's dive right in. Last week, we talked about culture and how it helps your organization in story-based marketing and branding. This week, we're going to be asking the question, how do I get a healthy culture? How do I begin to change the culture within my organization? Those are the questions we're going to ask today's guest. And I have with me, one more time, Super Bowl champion, Chief Culture Officer of Conquer Ninja Gym franchise, and entrepreneur in business and cultural leadership, Ben Utecht. Thanks, Ben, for joining us again.
John, I love it. Thank you for having me.
Ben, so last week we talked a lot about culture and how the culture is the leader's choice and kind of what a healthy culture looks like. This week I want to ask kind of the more difficult question. Have you ever been part of an organization that needed to have kind of a culture shift, and what did that look like?
Yeah. Well, we touched on it a little bit in our last video, but I went from a world championship organization to the last team that I played with in Cincinnati that hadn't won a playoff game in over 20 years. And it was not an issue of talent. They had incredible talent, both on offense and defense. So you got to ask yourself, okay, well, what's the difference? How can you have so many talented players and yet really struggle to, to win, especially in the most important time of the season, which is the playoffs? And I would just say that there were some very different choices made organizationally on the business administration side. How the scouting process, which means the type of players and the type of personalities that they have, bringing them onto the team, and then really how that team was able to really develop morale and practice a culture that is designed to improve the human condition of the player, right? A culture that's designed to promote more cohesion and more commitment from the player to the organization.
Right.
And and that's ultimately, I think, was a significant difference maker in world championship success and average success.
Yeah. So, I mean, you kind of mentioned some of the characteristics of what that looks like to be part of an organization that needs to have a culture shift. But like, if you could define, like, here are kind of the 3 or 4 main things, or 1 or 2 main things that you can tell that maybe your organization isn't a healthy organization and needs to change that culture.
So I would also say that, and this is true in sports entertainment as it is in corporate America, one of the things you deal with in sports is the old school style of leadership and coaching and the servant leadership style of coaching and leading. And a lot of times that's defined by fear versus love. And what love means is value and respect. Right? We're not talking about romantic love here. We're talking about deep value and respect for the people that you work with, right? So when you build a culture out of fear, then everybody is always walking in insecurity every day.
Yeah.
Because
am I going to lose my job?
Am I going to
perform up to the performance standards I need to?
Right. Now, here's the thing with servant leadership, which pours first into the human condition, you still don't subtract the realities of your job and the expectations of your job. You can still lose your job in a culture that celebrates servant leadership. But it's the way in which people are developed and treated that changes. Okay, typically in a fear-based model, a lot of times leaders are going to behave in ways to improve their power and improve their control.
Right.
And in my executive coaching, in my consulting, in my speaking, a lot of times when I experience other companies that, according to their employees, have a toxic culture, it's because of platforms of development that come out of that old school fear-based power and control model. A model of entitlement and a model of selfishness.
Sure.
And when your leaders are practicing power, control, fear, selfishness, the waterfall effect that will have on all of your employees is going to be negative. It's going to be draining. And so, and the sad thing is, John, is the majority of people that are out in the working world are experiencing cultures like that.
Right, right. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of cultures that really say, I value you as a person more than the product that you can produce for me.
Right.
There's not a lot of organizations that are going to come out and say that, right?
But another thing to note too, especially in the larger organizations, is that you would want to be careful, or I would be careful to say that that there isn't positivity, or there isn't healthy subcultures that exist within these large organizations. When you have thousands of employees, okay, and you speak to one department that is experiencing, a toxic culture, it may be because the leaders in that department are creating that subculture. When your executive leaders are actually doing a very good job at developing, the managers that are that are directly underneath them, or you might have other departments that have leadership that are actually doing a very good job. So you want to be careful not to just attach toxic culture to everything, but it exists. It exists in every organization, even in organizations that have worked really hard to define and to distribute positive culture. Even those organizations are going to have subcultures where leaders are going to have a negative impact on employees, right? So it's always a living organism. It's always something that you need to work on, which is why, like, my title as Chief Culture Officer is a new trending title, because companies are starting to realize, gosh, we talk all the time about culture, but we just throw that off onto HR. Well, HR, they have so much stuff that they have to do and take care of. So you really need to have one leader in a department that focuses completely on holding the culture of the organization accountable and developing it so that it can be healthy.
Yeah, and I would actually say a lot of those companies too don't actually continue to talk about, they might continue to talk about their mission and their vision. They might talk about their culture at one staff getaway once a year.
Right.
Or maybe they do it for 1 year, but then they just kind of forget about it, or they let it go to the wayside, or they let HR take care of it, or whatnot. And so what you have is you don't have, on paper you have a culture
by default,
right? But you don't have a culture
that
follows your mission, vision, and values.
A culture by default means that the leaders that you hire into the organization that are managing, the majority of the employees, those leaders, if they're not developed, are just left to their own behavioral devices. Okay, and every person in the world is an imperfect person.
Right.
And if you don't develop them, if you don't practice and help them grow in, these foundational beliefs or values, then all you can do is sit back and hope that you hired a really good person.
Right.
And that really good person is always going to do a really good job managing and treating their team members in the way that fills them up and makes them feel valued. And a lot of times that is not a strategy that's successful.
Yeah. So as leaders, what must we do to start a change in our culture that is more fitting to who we want to be as a brand? Like, how do we start that change?
That's a good question. So in my company, Believe in Culture, where I do a lot of keynote speaking, I do a lot of executive coaching. One of the programs that I built called the Champions Way really coming out of that Super Bowl championship team was trying to define what that culture was. As you know, to give people a real example of you know, what would this process look like. So I came up with what I call the 4 L's. What does it mean to be a champion listener, a champion learner, someone who asks great questions and then actually knows how to take the answers and apply them? What does it mean to be a champion language user, a great communicator, right? Because even individual words matter.
Sure.
The rhetoric that we use as leaders is so critical. And lastly, what does it mean to love your team members deeply? And you know, that always seems to be the most uncomfortable of the L's to talk about in corporate America. But the reality is that we're talking about a familial or a brotherly or sisterly form of love. It's value, it's respect. It's something that we practice as human beings every day. We just need to talk about it more. So you know, those 4 L's lay a construct for what a culture could be built on. And then I go through each of those and I define them, and then I give an example of you know, what the foundational beliefs are. Like, for example, with listening, one of the core beliefs to be a great listener is empathy. Empathy means putting yourself in the position of the person speaking.
Sure.
And so to be a great listener, you have to be empathetic, and you have to practice selflessness. And if you do that, what you will receive, what you will take in from the person speaking, will have much more value to you, and you will understand it more deeply and be able to react to it more positively and efficiently.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's good. That's good for sure. So in your experience, all right, how long does it take? You know, let's say somebody hires your organization, they purchase your videos or whatever, and they watch your content. How long does it really take to start to see a shift in culture?
Culture is the leader's choice. We talk about it all the time, and people, you know, get tired of hearing it. But that the answer actually is directly correlated to time, right? So it really comes down to the leaders. How serious are you about it? And how much time are you willing to put into practicing it? So culture typically takes, can typically take an organization, a pretty substantial amount of time.
Sure.
And a lot of that is wrapped up in how much time are they willing to put into the development of it and practice it right away.
Right.
And I think what happens in organizations is they recognize how critical it is, how important it is, and where they're doing it wrong, and they want to fix it. And so they bring in a consultant who really is a glorified Band-Aid. And that is a person that comes in and gives them 2 to 3 months of really good content, and then they leave. And the board or the executive leaders can check off the box. Hey, we did it. We brought somebody in. We grew a little bit, and then they go right back to doing what they were doing before.
Yeah.
That's why I think if a company is really serious about their culture, they need to, bring on somebody that, whose sole job is to develop and then hold that organization accountable to that culture, and to build a department that's focused on doing that.
Right.
But it's really based on the leader's choice.
Right.
If a leader really wants to change culture and they're willing to put a team on it and around it, it can be done in a much more quick and efficient way.
Right. I think what a lot of organizations sometimes get themselves into is, and we've heard this term before, is image management or brand management, right? They have to fix something. They have to change something from what people are saying about their organization, right? So they do hire these consultants. They hire people to come in. Like you said, it's just kind of a Band-Aid. But how does actually establishing a new healthy culture from a culture that maybe was an unhealthy one, how does actually establishing that culture affect what not only employees are going to say about it, but maybe what customers are going to say about your organization.
Yeah, so here's an example. So in my culture consulting firm, we have an assessment tool that we created that allows us to understand what it is the employees believe about the culture that their leaders have created. And if the leaders are willing to listen with humility, they can gain a lot of insight on what areas they need to focus on changing within the culture.
Right.
One of the key areas of distrust in every organization, it doesn't fail, is when employees don't understand why their leaders are making the decisions that they're making. They're just told,
Right.
here's what we've decided, go and do
Right.
it. They really struggle with that. And they lose trust in leadership because they don't really know, they become devalued then because they don't really understand what the purpose of their job is.
Yeah.
Okay, so what do you do with that as a leader? Well, I'd go back and I'd say, okay, gosh, let's take a look at our value system. Let's take a look at our beliefs. You know, how are we practicing building trust, building loyalty? How are we communicating? Okay, let's reevaluate this. You know what? We really need to do a better job of communicating with our employees to build trust and to build more commitment. So here's how we're going to do that and change your strategic process by which you communicate to your employees and make it consistent, practice it, and I promise you, very quickly, employees will start to respond positively and they'll trust you more because you're talking to them more.
Right.
It's a lot of this, John, is it's not that difficult.
Right.
We just have to stop for a moment and pause and take a breath and just spend a little time thinking about these things. And a lot of times we'll come up with great ideas on how we can make those improvements.
Right. Right. And all that affects not only what employees will say about an organization, but those employees will tell people about that, and those people will then in turn tell other people, and that is the whole basis of story-based marketing and branding. So if you ever want to change the way others talk about your brand, start by asking yourself, how does the culture of my organization play into what people say about my organization? And that's all the time we have for today. Thanks, Ben, so much for joining us again and being on this podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on social media. I'm John Oney, and we'll see you next time.